Whenever we think of the Pacific War, we tend to picture those intense and grueling jungle combats, in which soldiers often found themselves cautiously navigating through thick undergrowth, tangled vines and towering trees, ever wary of possible ambushes or sniper attacks from an invisible and elusive foe that was sure to shoot them dead if they got too close. And yet, we can also find in the Pacific theatre another kind of warfare that was equally deadly, just as intense, and probably even more gruesome than jungle warfare. Far away to the north, the Americans and Japanese fought for control of the Alaskan frontier. What started as a diversionary operation became a full battleground, as planes, warships and troops challenged the extreme temperatures that could plummet well below freezing and the treacherous and unforgiving Arctic terrain, which included icy waters, frozen tundras and rugged mountains covered by snow. This was an experience none of the participants would ever forget, most of them thinking they were lucky to even survive the deadly challenges of Arctic warfare. Thus, join us as we cover the Alaska campaign in its full depth, from the initial Japanese invasion and carrier strikes to the American recapture of the Aleutian Islands. These long videos are very difficult to make, so we hope that you will give us your comment, like and share, and will consider joining our Patreon or YouTube membership. Links in the description. Alternatively, you can support us and get yourself a treat with the sponsor for this video, Manscaped. In particular, it's their Performance Package 5.0 Ultra, the all-in-one grooming set for men. The star of the show is the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra. It's a waterproof razor with skin-safe blade heads designed for cutting anywhere from the most rugged to the most sensitive areas. Use the trimmer blade to get the hard work done, and swap in the foil blade to fine-tune and finish the job. The role of 2 trimmers for the price of 1. And recharge it pretty much anywhere via a USB-C connection. You'll never need another razor wherever you are. You'll also get the Weed Whacker 2.0 for dealing with nose and ear hair just as comfortably. Then there's the Crop Soother and Crop Preserver aftershave products, designed specifically for moisturizing and deodorizing delicate locations. Altogether, it's all you need to give your whole body the royal treatment when it comes to grooming, so you can perform and feel at your very best. The package comes with 2 free gifts, a pair of Boxers 2.0 and the Shared 2.0 to contain the whole set, be it at home or for traveling. To get these free gifts, free international shipping, and 20% off the price of your Performance Package 5.0 Ultra, head to manscaped.com/KNG or use our link in the description and use promo code K&G. Since the early planning of the Pacific War, Alaska, and the Aleutian Islands in particular, were seen as important staging grounds for dangerous invasion prospects, both by Japanese and American strategists. As we'll recall, the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty banned military bases and fortifications all across the Pacific, including both the Kuril Islands and the Western Aleutians in the North Pacific. This had left the American northern flank extremely vulnerable, with people in the US believing that Alaska could be taken almost overnight by a hostile force. By 1940, with the threat of war with Japan looming on the horizon, the American government had begun efforts to fortify and reinforce Alaska with the allocation of $350 million for defense, the arrival of the 4th Regiment, and the construction of military bases across the territory. Under the leadership of Lieutenant General John DeWitt, the Western Defense Command would be established to protect the Pacific coast, nominating the unorthodox Colonel Simon Buckner Jr. to command the defense of Alaska. Buckner's main priority was to construct an adequate air force, and as such, he began to illegally build airfields in the Aleutians via funds he had embezzled. He would succeed, and by the start of the war, the now Major General Buckner had 5 operational airfields and some 22,000 Army personnel. In the meantime, the Alaskan Navy was assigned a small force of World War I-era destroyers, requisitioned Coast Guard cutters, and S-boat submarines, while a small force of outdated P-36 Hawks, short-in-range P-40 Warhawks, and obsolete B-18 Bolos was delivered to the Alaskan Air Force. Within months of Pearl Harbor, however, the hard-working Buckner now boasted 14 operational military bases and 30 operable airfields, supporting 45,000 Army personnel, 4 infantry regiments, 3 coast artillery regiments, and a tank company. Additionally, Brigadier General William Butler was put in command of the recently established 11th Air Force, consisting of some 95 fighters and 46 bombers. As for the Japanese, as we've already seen, Admiral Yamamoto had decided to launch an invasion of the Aleutians and a strike at Dutch Harbour that was going to be executed concurrently with the invasion of Midway. Operation AL was thus assigned to an overwhelming naval force under Admiral Hosogaya of the 5th Fleet, divided into several smaller forces that included the 2nd Kido Butai of Rear Admiral Kakuta Kekuji, 2 invasion fleets mainly built around light cruisers and destroyers, a submarine detachment, a seaplane tender force, Hosogaya's main fleet built around the heavy cruiser Nachi, and a distant covering force under Vice Admiral Takasu Shiro. We've previously said that this operation was used by Yamamoto to disperse his forces, in that regard giving the Americans the notion that they were not going to be terribly overwhelmed if they chose to meet the Japanese in battle at Midway. But the Aleutians also held another valuable purpose. They could cover the northern flank of Midway once it was taken, and could also completely shield Japan from any future American strike similar to that of the Doolittle Raid. At least this is what modern historians believe nowadays, since in the past, historians tended to portray the operation as a feint to lure the American carriers away from Midway. Just as it had been done with Operation MI, American cryptanalysts and code breakers had deciphered the Japanese plans for an offensive against the Aleutians, concluding it was a diversion from the main attack against Midway. Admiral Nimitz then decided accordingly to leave Aleutian defense to the local Alaskan forces, while the bulk of the Pacific Fleet was directed to ambush the enemy at Midway. Yet he ended up sending Rear Admiral Robert Theobald's Task Force 8 out of a personal recommendation from Admiral King. Built around 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and a variety of destroyers, submarines, and other naval units, Task Force 8 had the mission to defend the North Pacific area, to which it arrived on May 27th. Theobald and Buckner would have to work side by side to oppose the Japanese landings and to reverse the gains achieved by the enemy. By May 25th, Hosogaya's northern force had been assembled at the Ominato Naval Base, departing towards its objectives 1 day later. The Japanese would invade Kiska Island with 1,260 SNLF Marines, while the North Seas Detachment of Major Hazumi Matsutoshi, consisting of 1,200 troops of the 301st Independent Battalion, was charged with the occupation of the islands of Attu and Edek. At this point, American intelligence had successfully identified Kiska and Attu as the first objectives of the invasion, yet Admiral Theobald disregarded this information, believing these islands were too worthless to warrant an invasion, and therefore choosing to defend Dutch Harbour instead. He then departed Kodiak on June 1st, heading to a position 500 miles east of Unalaska, although he was unable to do much due to the strict radio silence imposed for the Battle of Midway. By the night of June 2nd, Kakuta's carriers had gotten to their launch point, 165 miles south of Dutch Harbour. They had been concealed by the dense fog of the Pacific coast under a cold weather of around -13 Celsius. On June 3rd, 8 minutes before the northern summer's local sunrise, Kakuta had decided to launch his strike with some 46 aircraft, led by Lieutenant Abe Zenji, yet he was still worried that his pilots might not know how to return to their carriers due to the heavy weather. Prevented by the thick fog from flying in formation, the planes had to make their individual way towards their objective, but their flight was suddenly stopped when experienced Abe, who had taken part in the strikes at Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean, detected that the overcast was too low for effective dive bombing. Thus, 15 dive bombers and 11 Zeros aborted the strike, leaving only 19 aircraft under the command of Lieutenant Samajima Hiroichi to execute the attack on Dutch Harbour. The Japanese were expecting almost no resistance, yet to their surprise, they would be met by US fighters from Cold Bay and by several coastal artillery batteries. Furthermore, the defenders had been expecting a strike for several days, so they duly went to general quarters an hour before the detection of the Japanese aircraft, which was carried out by the seaplane tender Gillis around 0540. 5 minutes later, the Zeros finally appeared and made a strafing pass of Dutch Harbour's facilities, destroying one PBY Catalina that was trying to get in the air. Immediately, anti-aircraft fire erupted from the coastal artillery and from the vessels in the harbour, yet they couldn't prevent the enemy bombers from dropping their deadly load over Fort Meares's installations. 16 bombs managed to destroy 3 warehouses, 2 barracks and 3 Quonset huts, while the next 6 drops were accidentally delivered over Mount Ballyhoo without achieving much damage. The following 6 bombs knocked out a radio transmitter and destroyed another Quonset hut, and the final 6 drops hit a fire watcher's bunker, an army truck, and some naval facilities at Powerhouse Hill. All in all, only superficial damage had been achieved, and the vessels at harbour, although detected, hadn't been damaged. With this strike over, Samejima led his torpedo bombers northwards, missing the appearance of Cold Bay's Warhawks by 10 minutes. Upon learning that there were destroyers at Dutch Harbour, Kakuta decided to dispatch a second wave of 33 aircraft to destroy these ships, but the immense coldness of the weather iced up the plane's carburetors, forcing them to return to their carriers. Additionally, 4 Type 97 EA-10 float planes from the cruisers Mayer and Tekau were launched, but they were discovered by Umnak's Warhawks and suffered 2 losses in the struggle. In the following hours, Kakuta's carriers were spotted by 2 PBYs, yet their transmissions didn't reach Dutch Harbour and they were quickly shot down. The Japanese admiral now had to turn southeast to support the invasion of Adak, but he was disappointed with his Dutch Harbour strike and ended up deciding to launch a second attack instead. On the morning of June 4th, however, this time 2 PBYs would get to actually report Kakuta's location before getting destroyed. 6 Marauder bombers from Umnak and 6 from Cold Bay were launched to strike at the Japanese carriers, but they were thwarted by the heavy fog and had to abort. Only one B-26, under Captain George Thornborough, kept on and managed to find the enemy, but he was shot down without achieving any hits. In the afternoon, 2 B-17s and Captain Robert Miles's Marauders from Umnak also managed to find Kakuta's carriers, though their attacks were very unsuccessful as well. At 1600, all preparations were finally ready, and Kakuta was at last able to launch his second strike on Dutch Harbour with some 30 aircraft under the command of Lieutenant Abe. By 1740, the Japanese planes started to appear on the horizon and got to destroy one PBY that was intercepted on their route. Just 15 minutes later, Abe's dive bombers began to attack Dutch Harbour's facilities, managing to destroy 4 brand new 6,666 barrel steel fuel tanks, some 22,000 barrels of fuel, and the merchantman Northwestern. This attack was followed by Lieutenant Masatake Yamagami's torpedo bombers, which blew a hole in the top of the seaplane hangar at Mount Ballyhoo, destroyed an anti-aircraft gun, and severely damaged an ammunition store before departing around 1830. At this point, some Warhawks from Port Glen had come to meet them, resulting in a struggle that ended with 1 Japanese dive bomber and 2 P-40s destroyed. Concurrent to the second attack on Dutch Harbour, the Battle of Midway had developed unfavourably for the Japanese, resulting in the almost complete destruction of the 1st Kido Butai. Alarmed about his failure to decisively defeat the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Yamamoto had ordered the 2nd Kido Butai southwards to join the carrier Hiryu in its final efforts to destroy the American forces. But Kakuta was already committed in his strike on Dutch Harbour, knowing full well that his carriers had to refuel, and that they couldn't get to the battlefield quickly enough. After conducting a successful refueling during the night, Kakuta's 2nd Kido Butai commenced its travel southwards on the morning of June 5th, but they would be promptly stopped by Yamamoto, who by now had realized that the Midway disaster was unsalvageable. While the Japanese forces retreated and Kakuta advanced to rendezvous with Hosogaya's fleet, Theobald and Butler decided to launch a worthless scouting operation over the empty Bering Sea, believing that an invasion of Dutch Harbour was imminent. With the American airbase at Umnak revealed, the invasion of the nearby Adak Island was also discarded, yet Yamamoto decided to go on with the invasions of Kiska and Attu anyway. On the night of June 6th, the 1,260 SNLF Marines of Commander Mukai Nifumi were put ashore at Kiska's Reynard Cove and rapidly managed to advance south towards the harbour. By 02:15 on June 7th, the 10 American sailors deployed at a weather station on Kiska Harbor were startled awake by the overwhelming attack of the Japanese forces. 8 of them managed to escape into the mountainside and survived for a couple of days under dastardly cold weather, but in the end they eventually had to surrender. At the same time that the Japanese were capturing Kiska, Major Hazumi's North Seas Detachment was landing at Holt's Bay. They faced no resistance, only the difficult task of climbing the snow-covered Holt's Bay Chichagov Harbor Pass, and soon the island was taken and its 44 inhabitants were turned into war prisoners. With Operation AL concluded, Yamamoto dispatched a strong fleet to support Kakuta and the Japanese forces at the Aleutians. Meanwhile, with the Battle of Midway also over, Admiral Nimitz had decided to refit the aircraft of Admiral Sperance's Task Force 16, and then sent them northward to hunt down the 2nd Kido Butai. But just as Speranz had gotten halfway to his objective, the American reconnaissance managed to discover the Japanese presence on the islands of Kiska and Attu. Nimitz feared that the Japanese land-based aircraft could be waiting for the American carriers, so he decided to recall Sperance's task force and not risk getting into a possible enemy trap. The Japanese then began to turn the islands of Kiska and Attu into their major bastions in the North Pacific, bringing a wide array of aircraft, midget submarines, coastal defense and anti-aircraft guns. In response, the Americans decided to evacuate the Western Aleutians, interning some 881 native Aleuts in relocation camps in southeastern Alaska and burning their villages to the ground so the enemy could not use them for shelter. Although the Midway operation had been a disaster, with the full extent of it being concealed from the public, the Japanese had managed to secure a foothold in North America, something that caused great concern amongst the American population. But as Buckner said, having in mind the hostility of both the unforgiving terrain and of the staunch American defenders, if the Japanese come they may get a foothold, but it will be their children who get as far as Anchorage and their grandchildren who'll make it to the States, and by then they'll all be American citizens anyway. With the Japanese fortifying their newly conquered islands, Buckner, Theobald and Butler wouldn't sit idly by either. A grim long-range air-sea war of attrition would thus begin, lasting for some 11 months, in which the US was in no position to launch a major offensive and recapture the Aleutians. Fittingly dubbed the 1,000-Mile War, the Americans would launch approximately a dozen different air raids over Kiska in the month of June alone, including the 3-day Kiska Blitz. Furthermore, on June 20th, American intelligence detected Kakuta's carrier force re-entering the Bering Sea and believed that it was a renewed invasion of Alaska. This prompted the execution of Operation Bingo, the first mass airlift in US history, in which 140 cargo planes worth of reinforcements were brought to Alaska through 46 seized civilian aircraft. Although Buckner wasn't ready yet to recapture his lost territories, he had now been sufficiently reinforced to completely hold Alaska against any force that the Japanese could throw at him. But as the defenders tried to inflict as much damage as possible, the invaders were quickly reinforcing their positions on the islands of Attu and Kiska. With the harsh Alaskan winter approaching, Generals Buckner and Butler continued to order air raids over the island of Kiska during the month of July. Significantly, submarine attacks would manage to sink 2 Japanese destroyers and severely damage another 2. The Japanese also attempted a few of their own raids in July, but their efforts would be fruitless due to the frigid North Pacific weather, and Admiral Theobald would be forced to relinquish his at-sea command of the North Pacific Force due to his failure to carry out offensive operations against Kiska. He would be replaced with Rear Admiral William Smith on August 3rd, who would be immediately assigned the bombardment of Kiska as a distraction for Operation Watchtower. Mere hours later, he would depart Kodiak with the bulk of his task force, arriving at his destination on August 7th, and conducting a very ineffective bombing of the Japanese base due to poor visibility and shaky navigation, which forced Smith to shell the harbour by indirect fire from a range of 11 miles. The failure to inflict damage over the Japanese base meant that the diversionary attack also lacked success, since no relief would be sent to Kiska. Afterwards, many of the resources allocated to the North Pacific by both sides would begin to be redirected to the south due to the importance of the Guadalcanal campaign. Despite this, the Americans believed they continued to enjoy a 4-to-1 advantage in air strength over their enemies, and this encouraged them to start planning for an advance down the Aleutians towards Kiska and Attu. For this, however, they would need to be closer to the Japanese bases to adequately support their offensive with air raids. Because of the region's poor flying conditions, General DeWitt decided to carry out the construction of an airfield on Tanaga Island, which was closer to the Japanese presence, although the island of Adak and its superior anchorage would finally be selected to be the site for the new airfield. In the meantime, the relationships between the American commanders were growing more tense each day, with General Buckner writing a poem about Admiral Theobald that the latter found gratuitously insulting. This almost cost both men their commands, but with the aid of DeWitt, they would eventually find common ground to cooperate again. On the night of August 28th, the Adak operation was at last set in motion, with the submarines Triton and Tuna stealthily moving to the island to land some 38 Alaska scouts under Colonel Lawrence Kastner. The commandos would then rapidly paddle to Kuluk Bay, where they found no enemy presence, so they would relay this information to Buckner the following morning. Thus, some 4,500 men from the 7th Division, commanded by Brigadier General Eugene Landrum, were prepared to sortie from Unalaska in some 250 transports, finally landing at Adak on August 30th to establish an outpost and begin construction of the new airfield. On that same day, a Japanese submarine snuck into Nazem Bay, stealthily torpedoing the seaplane tender Casco before it was sunk by the destroyer Reed. At Adak, construction of the new airfield was highly prioritized, with many marauders and warhawks continuously patrolling the island from dawn until dusk to cover the engineers as they worked. In just about 10 days, the hard-working Americans would finish their Adak airfield, and on September 10th, the first aircraft would begin to arrive, now being only 250 miles away from Kiska. 4 days later, the first airstrike from this closer location was launched, repeatedly strafing and swiftly dropping bombs over Japanese vessels and installations on the island. Considerable damage was inflicted in result, including 2 minesweepers sunk, yet the bad weather would prevent the Americans from launching more air incursions for some time. Meanwhile, a detachment of 800 soldiers was sent to occupy the nearby Atka Island on September 16th, establishing an emergency fighter landing field there. And on the next day, fearing a probable enemy invasion on the nearby Amchitka Island, Major General Higuchi Kichiro of the Northern District Army would decide to temporarily abandon their outpost on Attu Island to reinforce their position on Kiska. Finally, the Americans would launch their second airstrike on September 25th, in which the Canadian squadron leader Kenneth Boomer shot down an A6M2 and became the first Allied pilot of the war to claim both German and Japanese kills. Despite their second successful raid, the Americans would lose the element of surprise a mere 5 days later, when Japanese reconnaissance at last managed to discover the new Adak base. A number of Japanese sorties then followed, before ceasing unsuccessfully on October 5th. On that same day, a survey of Amchitka convinced Higuchi that it was impossible to build an airstrip there, so he would decide to send the 83rd Independent Battalion of Lieutenant Colonel Yonegawa Isumu to reoccupy Attu. Departing from Paramushiro, Yonegawa's men would arrive at the island on October 29th, with reinforcements following over the next several weeks. The last major action of the month would happen on October 16th, when 6 marauders managed to damage the destroyer Hatsuharu in Kiska Harbor. More importantly, they also scored 1 critical hit on the destroyer Oboro, which exploded and sank without survivors, at the cost of 1 lost B-26. By early October, Siska also enjoyed a massive anti-aircraft concentration and an impressive network of underground bunkers. Despite the fact that Admiral Hosagaya had turned it into an impervious fortress, Tokyo had shown no interest in keeping their presence in the Aleutian Islands, their original plan being to keep the enemy at bay until winter and then fall back to the northern Kurils. Yet the American occupation of Adak, coupled with further landings of small forces on the Atka, Zakuan, Tanaga and St. Paul Islands, eventually persuaded the Japanese that these advances were a prelude to a northern invasion of the homeland. As a result, the Japanese decided not to abandon the Aleutians for the winter, and on November 1st, the Japanese Empire finally published a joint plan to strengthen the defences of Kiska and Attu by February 1943, as well as to establish a seaplane base at the currently unoccupied island of Shemya. Meanwhile, Admiral Nimitz had decided to occupy Amchitka and construct a new airfield on the island. Contrary to the Japanese reports, the Alaska Scouts had determined that Amchitka was long, narrow and flat, except for the inevitable volcano at one end. And as Nimitz was confident that his American engineers could make an operating airbase out of any flat space overnight, the occupation of Amchitka, codenamed Operation Longview, was rapidly authorized. On November 7th, the Japanese reoccupation of Attu was also discovered by the Americans, so General Butler immediately started to send missions against the island. Led by the fearless Colonel William Eric Erickson, the Americans successfully managed to destroy several beach installations, sink a cargo ship, and scrap 9 Zeros at Holt's Bay. On November 23rd, the first Shemya convoy at last departed Paramushiro, carrying 1,100 troops of the 303rd Independent Battalion and escorted by a small fleet under Admiral Hosagaya. Yet before the island could be occupied, on November 27th, an American B-24 from Adak flew by overhead and managed to sink a transport off Attu. Further reports that there was a strong enemy task force in the North Pacific forced Hosagaya in the end to postpone Shemya landings and return back to Paramushiro. Ironically, there was no American task force in the North Pacific, as most of the vessels under Admiral Theobald had been taken away for the invasion of North Africa. The following day, convinced by Ericsson's constant raids that he couldn't afford to divide his forces, Hosagaya finally decided to take the entire convoy to Kiska, successfully landing the troops on the night of December 2nd. On December 18th, mere hours after an air bombardment by Ericsson that destroyed every building on Amchitka, General Buckner decided to send the Alaska Scouts to Amchitka in another scouting expedition to study the terrain. Yet what they found was very troubling. Signs that the Japanese had been there recently, evidently doing the same, so efforts to launch the operation would have to be increased. Nonetheless, the Alaska Scouts would determine that a fighter strip could be built in 2 to 3 weeks, and a main airfield in 3 to 4 months. Finally, the last action of 1942 would be off Unimak on December 27th, as destroyer minesweeper Wasmuth was sunk by 2 exploding depth charges wrenched overboard by stormy seas. By the end of the year, the 11th Air Force had destroyed at least 50 enemy planes in combat and had lost only a dozen of its own in battle. Yet, it had also lost almost 80 planes to quote-unquote other causes, such as weather accidents. In spite of the weather, Ericsson's handful of bombers managed to drop more than £500,000 of explosives on the enemy bases during the last 3 months of 1942. His innovative tactics would be decisive for the success of the 11th Air Force during the Aleutian Air Campaign, and with the exception of one brief October mission to the States, Ericsson had been in the air and in combat on virtually every flyable day of the campaign. On January 4, 1943, Thomas C. Kinkaid, the American admiral that had seen action in more big naval battles than anyone else, finally arrived at Kodiak to replace Theobald as North Pacific Area Commander. A mere day later, Kinkaid ordered the full troop landings on Amchitka to be executed, immediately assembling a taut little combat force of 3 battle-hardened cruisers and 7 destroyers under Admiral McNorris. Yet once again the weather, the most important enemy in Alaska, would force the Americans to postpone the operation for a few days. Meanwhile, the slow straggling of Japanese reinforcements continued, so Butler decided to launch recon flights over Amchitka and bomber strikes against Kiska and Attu, successfully sinking the freighter Montreal Maru off the Komandorski Islands and the Kotahira Maru off Attu. The success of the American air raids during this period meant that between December 17th and January 30th, only 12 resupply ships would reach Kiska and Attu. By nightfall on January 11th, the weather continued to look bad, with the storm slacking only just a bit. Yet Admiral McNorris decided to order the 2,100 engineer and army troops under Brigadier General Lloyd Jones to go ashore in the morning regardless of the weather. Shortly after midnight, he even ordered the destroyer Warden to move into Constantine Harbor and land a detachment of Alaska Scouts under Lieutenant Colonel William Verbeck. Blasting through the surf at the harbor mouth shortly before dawn, the Warden would successfully land Verbeck's scouts, yet when she steamed back out of the harbor, the brutal current dashed her into a pinnacle rock, thus leaving the destroyer powerless. Destroyer Dewey then raced off to her assistance, but the Warden would finally capsize and suffer the death of 14 Americans before the crew could be rescued. Once on the ground, however, Verbeck's scouts cleared the island and found it devoid of Japanese forces, so the rest of the transports were promptly sent, successfully landing all 2,100 soaked, swamped and oil-drenched men by the end of the day. With Amchitka Island secured, the American engineers immediately began construction of the new airfield. Yet on January 23rd, a Japanese float plane would finally discover the American presence on the island. Japanese commanders were shocked by the unexpected occupation of Amchitka, just 50 miles from their main base at Kiska, so they immediately started to launch a series of air raids over the island before the new airfield could be constructed. If completed, American air attacks would be relentless, and the Kurils would be at great peril. Though the fierce Japanese air raids caused considerable damage in the following days, Colonel Benjamin Talley's miraculous engineers managed to finish off the Amchitka runway by the end of the month, so that a P-40 squadron could be landed on the new base on January 28th. After that, bombing missions over Amchitka became more sporadic, and finally ceased by February 18th, as the Japanese couldn't waste the few planes they had in the North Pacific. Furthermore, 10 P-38s soon joined the Warhawks and began daily raids against Kiska. For Kinkaid, an aggressive, simple and direct commander, this was only the beginning of his campaign to drive the Japanese out of the Aleutian Islands, out of Alaska, and out of any American soil. Now he envisioned to starve them out by establishing an unbreakable naval blockade, which he saw as his best chance at forcing the Japanese to abandon the Aleutian Islands. For this task, Kinkaid assembled a tough little striking force, consisting of the heavy cruiser Indianapolis, the light cruiser Richmond, and 4 destroyers, under the command of Admiral McNorris. Their first action came in early February, as Kinkaid sent McNorris to blockade the enemy's approaches to Kiska and Attu. After steaming west into action, Task Force 8 received a submarine report on February 18th, claiming that several enemy ships were harboured at Attu's Holtz Bay, so McNorris would decide to carry out an attack on Attu. Yet the same signal also reached Adak, where General Butler's forces determined to launch a bomber strike against Holtz Bay, to be carried out before McNorris could arrive. Unexpectedly, the Americans were met with clear weather instead of fog, which allowed McNorris to travel at full speed towards Attu, and so both the naval and air forces would reach the island at the same time. What is worse, McNorris didn't see any enemy vessels on site as he arrived, only a B-17 bomber appearing at 10,000 feet, which mistakenly identified the American fleet as Japanese. The Flying Fortress then attempted 2 bomb runs, but luckily disaster was averted as the bomb releases failed to function. Sparse anti-aircraft fire would finally force the bomber to withdraw, and McNorris would nonetheless take the occasion to shell Chicago Village and Holtz Bay. From there, McNorris would continue on a westward course, as he reasoned that the best way to enforce the blockade was to cruise just outside of Japanese home waters and intercept any outbound convoys. Once again, the Americans would see both luck and misfortune, as the Japanese had actually launched a convoy on February 13th. Because the Americans had never ventured to this part of the world, the convoy would be caught with its guard down and dispersed, but luckily for the Japanese, McNorris would only get to intercept the 3,100-ton Akagane Maru, which would be swiftly sunk with gunfire. Though undetected, the other Japanese vessels would finally decide to return to Paramishiro because of the high enemy activity in the area. With this small action, the blockade of Kiska and Attu had started, an action that Admiral Theobald would have never dared to take. This left General Higuchi in a great predicament, knowing that his only options were to withdraw from the Aleutians, continue to reinforce and fortify the strongholds at Attu and Kiska, or persuade the navy to attack the American supply lines that supported the Adak and Amchitka bases. The latter request was immediately vetoed by Admiral Hosagaya, as IJN High Command thought it was cowardly to attack merchant and supply shipping. Higuchi's request to abandon the islands was also denied, as Tokyo believed that the Kurils and northern Japan would be left too vulnerable. In the end, Higuchi's troops would have to keep up their frenzied efforts to finish their fortifications and airfields, even though American bombs would undo all their work almost daily. He also set out to prepare for an enemy attack, but only his anti-aircraft strength was impressive. He had little mechanized strength, no mountain artillery, fewer than 8,000 troops on Kiska, and around 1,000 at Attu, although none of these were first-line soldiers, nor did they have high morale. The beaches were also sparsely defended, with mines and barbed wire, and he had been forced to surrender the air to the Americans, as the tremendous losses of the Guadalcanal campaign had left the Japanese with no seaplanes to spare for the North Pacific. By early March, the constant American bombing had sunk or crippled at least 40 vessels, and inflicted a total of 3,477 casualties. As Higuchi's garrisons were running short on food and ammunition, a large convoy would finally slip past the American blockade on March 9th. But this was to be the last, as Admiral McNorris would turn back half a dozen ships in the next week. The effectiveness of the American blockade would finally force Admiral Hosagaya to assemble all his forces to run the blockade. Their mission was to escort 2 big transports, filled to the gunwales, while 4 destroyers would also be loaded with an overflow of supplies. Resolved to blast his way through, he personally took command of his northern force, consisting of 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 5 destroyers. On March 22nd, he would at last steam out of the Kurils in battle order, with the heavy cruiser Nachi as his flagship. Meanwhile, Admiral Kinkaid had decided to reform Task Force 8 into the new Task Force 16, mainly replacing the Indianapolis for the older heavy cruiser Salt Lake City, which had recently finished repairs after the damage sustained in the Battle of Cape Esperance. March 22nd would also be the day in which Admiral McNorris departed Dutch Harbour, heading far west once again to enforce the blockade of the Aleutian Islands. By the morning of March 26th, Task Force 16 would be as far as 200 miles west of Attu, crossing the ocean deep about 100 miles south of the Russian Komandorski Islands. At this point, McNorris had received a number of reports from American PBYs that had seen an enemy fleet of many ships appearing and disappearing somewhere to the west. The Socratic admiral was certain that this was a big enemy convoy, and he was anxious to intercept it, but he didn't think he would be facing anything more than a few destroyers. At dawn, as the American fleet routinely went into battle stations, the leading destroyer, Kolan, made radar contact with several unidentified ships about 10 miles north. In response, McNorris gathered his ships into a close pack around his flagship, the Richmond, and made a stately fleet turn towards the northeast to intercept the enemy. At the same time, Japanese lookouts successfully identified the approaching American vessels, so Hosagaya would immediately order his transports to fall behind, while he maneuvered his 9 fast warships between the cargo ships and the Americans. As the 2 fleets approached each other on a collision course, American lookouts would identify 4 enemy cruisers moving fast towards Richmond's starboard bow, while the Japanese destroyers swung to bear down on the port bow. McNorris was outgunned, outspared, and outnumbered by 2 to 1, but he would ultimately decide to fight nonetheless, as he reasoned that if he refused to accept battle and the Japanese got to resupply Attu and Kiska, then the campaign could be lengthened by entire months. While he notified Kinkaid and requested air support, he planned to draw the enemy cruisers away with a feint, to then dash in behind them and sink the cargo ships. Around 0840, the Japanese cruisers opened fire on Richmond, which was swinging into a westward turn and would be straddled by the Japanese fire. Hosagaya then decided to shift fire towards the bigger Salt Lake City, straddling the heavy cruiser as well, yet the Americans would also start to respond, successfully putting the Nachi's main battery out of action. This forced Hosogawa to change course and swing into closer range to bring his other batteries into play, sharply cutting McNorris off from the Japanese transports. In response, McNorris made a 40-degree turn to port to confuse the enemy's gunners, but Hosogawa would take this chance to launch 8 torpedoes at Salt Lake City. Nevertheless, Captain Bertram Rogers expertly maneuvered the cruiser to evade them, and even managed to evade the enemy salvos with uncanny timing. At the same time, the Salt Lake City continued to fire at Nachi, successfully hitting her 3 times and causing heavy damage. Further hits from Richmond and Coughlin would finally force the Nachi to slow down and drop back as it smoked heavily. At 09:03, Richmond ceased firing, trying to get around the enemy warships to attack the transports. Yet Hosogawa would order the light cruiser Tama to cut across the arc of the American westerly turn. At this point, Hosogawa had deployed his vessels to cut off the Americans' escape route, and the Abukuma column had already been positioned to guard the transports, so the outnumbered Task Force 16 would be forced to make a desperate run for their lives towards the west and northwest. An interval in the battle then ensued, in which both sides called for air support, but were informed that none was coming. Heavy cruiser Maya and Salt Lake City were the only ones to trade fire during this interval, with Maya scoring a hit on Salt Lake City's amidships catapult at 09:10, which destroyed a float plane. 10 minutes later, Maya scored a second, more inconsequential hit on the cruiser's quarterdeck. Meanwhile, as the Tama and the Abukuma continued to close in, Richmond would be forced to open fire once again at 09:52 to make the enemy back off slightly. Furthermore, the shock of Salt Lake City's own gunfire damaged its hydraulic steering system at 10:02, which made maneuvering harder. Over 200 shells fell around her in the next few minutes, but at 10:10, the cruiser was finally hit by a dud that managed to flood an engine room, thus forcing the steering cruiser to slow down. In an instant response, McNorris ordered his destroyers to lay a smokescreen, which gave the Americans some cover while they retired westwards. Through his superior positioning, Hosogawa had forced the Americans, already in Japanese waters, to flee west, directly away from Alaska and even deeper towards the Kurils air bases. The American crews even believed that their only chance was to be interned in Russia. Yet Hosogawa squandered this great opportunity to exploit his superior speed as he continued to zigzag to bring full broadsides to bear. Still, the Japanese were closing the gap by a steady 2.5 knots. Thinking that in another hour the Japanese would be at point-blank range, McNorris decided to make a wide turn to the south, covered by the destroyer's smokescreen. As Hosogawa failed to notice this, the Japanese launched a total of 16 torpedoes at the same time, all of them missing. Yet at 11:03, Salt Lake City would further suffer another critical hit, causing more flooding and a list. Nonetheless, the Japanese had been fooled momentarily, so McNorris began to slip away to the south. Upon noticing, Hosogawa immediately ordered a sharp turn to port, while his forces continued to fire. In response, McNorris ordered his destroyers to launch a feint torpedo attack, which forced the Japanese to back off, and allowed Salt Lake City to regain full speed. But at 11:50, as the engineers attempted to fight the damage in Salt Lake City, the Americans would accidentally dump salt water into a fuel line, and the cruiser began to slow to a halt. McNorris immediately ordered the destroyer Dale to lay smoke in tight circles, while he got Richmond close to evacuate the American crew. Yet Rogers refused to abandon ship, as he wanted to get steam up again, though he needed time for that. Thus, McNorris signaled his remaining 3 destroyers to execute a suicide torpedo attack. Driving northwest at 37 knots, the destroyers Bailey and Monaghan concentrated their fire on Nachi, while the Kolan dueled the Maya, successfully inflicting light damage on both cruisers. Yet the Japanese quickly responded and managed to drive away the Monaghan and Kolan. Only the Bailey continued forward, suffering 3 hits by 1200, before it launched 5 torpedoes 3 minutes later, although they would all miss. As it retired, Bailey would suffer a 4th hit that caused heavy damage. This, however, gained enough time for the Salt Lake City to regain power and start to make headway once again. At 12:02, Rogers would further resume firing, yet his blue-dyed armor-piercing rounds had all been expended, so he had to use some high-explosive incendiary shells. At this point, Hosogawa was very nervous, as he had intercepted McNorris's call for air support 3 hours ago, and thus believed enemy aircraft were about to appear. Furthermore, the smokescreen had prevented him from noticing that the Salt Lake City had come to a stop, and being low on fuel and ammunition, he thought that the Americans were likely to get away. Still, he was uncertain about his next move, at least until Roger's explosive shells began to fall on Nachi. The unfamiliar explosions convinced Hosogawa that he was being bombed by American bombers, finally forcing him to order the Attu run aborted at 12:03. By 12:12, the Japanese would be out of range, leaving the Americans incredulous as to why the enemy was retreating. McNorris's luck had returned, and relieved, he then began to retreat back to Adak. Though the Americans had suffered more damage in the battle, this had been an important strategic victory for the United States, as the convoy to resupply Kiska and Attu had been successfully stopped. Though the Japanese would attempt to launch 2 additional resupply convoys in April, weather would ultimately stop them, so the Attu garrison would not see any relief arrive to the island until its eventual demise. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands would be the last slug-out gunnery duel ever to take place between opposing surface fleets without the use of combat airplanes. Lasting for 3.5 hours, it would also be the longest continuous gunnery duel in modern naval history. Upon returning to Paramushiro on March 28th, Hosogawa was seen as a coward due to the fact that he withdrew against an inferior force, and thus he would be replaced by Vice Admiral Kawase Shiro as commander of the 5th Fleet. For the rest of the war, Hosogawa would be based in Truk, serving as the governor of the South Seas Mandate. McNorris also received substantial criticism from American participants due to questionable actions during the battle, yet Admirals Nimitz and Kinkaid would ultimately praise McNorris for his glorious and unlikely victory. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands would prove to be the end of the Japanese naval supremacy in the North Pacific, as no further Japanese convoys would reach the Aleutians until the end of the campaign. Thus, the success of Kinkaid's daring blockade had sealed the fate of the Japanese garrisons at Kiska and Attu. Yet before any invasion plans could be drawn up, Admiral Kinkaid and General Buckner needed to secure their advanced bases and work the remaining bugs in their war machinery. One of their first major joint decisions would be to move the Army, Navy and Air Force headquarters out to Adak, 1,000 miles nearer the enemy. Soon Adak would become the center of the frenzy, growing into an important naval base. Supply was still an outstanding problem for the American ground forces, and this further harmed morale of the troops and caused an important medical problem. As for the Navy, the North Pacific Submarine Force spent the first few months of Kinkaid's command healing its wounds, gathering its strength for the final push, and running routine patrols, although with no memorable actions that could be recounted. A new PT boat squadron also had to be assembled, employing the Higgins model, which was fitted with hot air heaters, because the previous squadron had been severely handicapped by the gruesome North Pacific weather, losing half of the PT boats back in January. The 11th Air Force of General Butler, meanwhile, lost 11 planes to the weather in January, and so bad was the weather that only a handful of missions would be carried out. In February, more missions could thankfully be launched, but nearly half of them made impotent runs over Kiska because of the constant crippling failures of bomb bay rack mechanisms, which froze when caked with corrosion and ice. The drop in efficiency of the bomber missions also coincided with the temporary leave of the fearless Colonel Eriksson, who was replaced by Colonel Earl DeFord as Chief of Bomber Command. DeFord took matters personally at hand, and thus he would often come into conflict with some of Eriksson's ideas, which were still being upheld by his former men. As we'll recall, Admiral Kinkaid had begun planning the invasion of Kiska upon assuming command, submitting a general plan that would then be approved by Admiral Nimitz, General DeWitt, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Though DeWitt had recommended the 35th Division of Major General Charles Corlett, which had already been involved in the occupation of Adak under the experienced General Landrum, Washington would instead assign the 7th Motorized Division for the invasion. Commanded by Major General Albert Brown, the the Hourglass Division had been trained for desert fighting in North Africa since the start of the war, and as neither tanks, trucks, nor armoured or desert tactics would be of any use in the Aleutians, the division had to be retrained as an Arctic amphibious division in a period of 3 months. Thankfully, amphibious assault specialists, such as Major General Holland Smith, and men accustomed to the Aleutian theatre, such as Colonels Kastner and Eriksson, would be sent in January to start the retraining of the 7th Division. By February, however, Washington had assigned an insufficient number of ships for the invasion of Kiska. Thus, at the end of the month, Kinkaid came up with a brilliant idea: to bypass Kiska and use the available shipping strength and a regimental group to hit the lightly defended Attu, leaving Kiska completely surrounded, and hopefully forcing the Japanese to evacuate it. This new plan, codenamed Operation Landcrab and under the command of Vice Admiral Francis Rockwell, was immediately approved, and on April 1st, all major commanders of the theatre would meet in a conference at San Diego to iron out the final details. Yet the San Diego conference would quickly deteriorate into a series of disruptive arguments between the two new commanders, Smith and Rockwell, and the experienced Alaskan leaders, Buckner and DeWitt. As a result, warnings from the Alaskan advisors would not be acted upon, and Buckner's request to employ his own forces would be denied because of Rockwell and Brown's complaints. In the end, they would reach the compromise to hold Buckner's 4th Regiment in reserve at Adak, ready to ship out and hit Attu in less than a day. Finally, on April 18th, as it was revealed that there were at least 1,600 Japanese at Attu, Rockwell decided to commit the entire 7th Division and its reinforcements for Operation Landcrab. Totaling some 10,000 men, Rockwell would have to find the shipping for them somewhere. As a last note, the Americans were planning to send a small team of combat specialists to come up behind the Japanese, tasked with preventing the enemy from falling back into the mountains, where they might hold out for weeks or months. In that regard, Brown would appoint Captain William Willoughby to lead this Provincial Scout Battalion, which would be formed by the 410 top soldiers of the division. Meanwhile, though General Butler had been ordered to saturate the enemy's Aleutian defences with bombs, the 11th Air Force would be grounded for a full week by stinging 100-knot winds and heavy snow. Nonetheless, Butler's forces would fly a total of 1,175 combat sorties in April, though only 4,000 pounds would fall on Attu, as the rest was instead dropped over Kiska, because Attu had the worst foggy weather of all the Aleutian Islands, and because the Americans didn't want to draw attention towards the real objective of the upcoming operation. Finally, on April 24th, the Landcrab assault force would set sail in 5 terribly overcrowded transports with a strong naval escort, so the 7th Division was on its way to bring an end to the Aleutian campaign. By the end of April, the 7th Division finally steamed into Cold Bay, signalling that the last phase of preparations for the start of the battle were to begin. Thus, Butler at last shifted his focus to Attu on May 1st, with his airmen seeking every opening in the maddening cloud cover to soften up the island for the impending invasion. At this point, Colonel Eriksson had again taken command of the 11th Bomber Command, and Admiral McNorris would also take the opportunity to shell the island with naval gunfire. At Attu, Colonel Yamasaki Yasuro had been appointed to command the 2nd District Force of the North Seas Garrison, arriving at the island by submarine in April, with orders to hold Attu without outside help until late May, when it was supposed that he would receive reinforcements. For this task, he counted with 2 infantry battalions, a provisional anti-aircraft battalion, 2 engineer companies, and a company of mountain artillery. Truly meagre forces against the full might of an American division. In the meantime, Rockwell and Brown spent May 1st and 2nd discussing the landing plans against the main Japanese position at Chichagov Harbour. Although Rockwell wanted to land the entire 7th Division at Sarana Bay, as he didn't believe he could maintain the full-scale supply of 2 different landing points, it would be Colonel William Alexander's Plan E that would finally be approved. Favoured by General Brown, the plan was to land a regimental force at Holt's Bay and another at Massacre Bay, holding the 3rd Regimental Force in reserve, while Captain Willoughby's Scout Battalion was to land at Beach Scarlet and press eastwards. The key to the plan was to have all 3 forces join up in the mountain pass between Holtz and Massacre valleys, thus trapping the Japanese at Chichagov Valley and leaving it open to naval bombardment, air attack, and the 7th Division's massed advance from the high ground. As we can see, Willoughby's landing would be a very dangerous task, so it was planned that 245 men of the Scout Battalion would land from 2 giant submarines at night, in complete silence, to rapidly surprise the enemy from behind. But if the Americans jumped into the rubber boats, their equipment would clank and the heavy weapons would rip holes in the fragile rafts. So Willoughby instead planned to come topside, inflate their rubber boats on the afterdecks, and quietly crowd the boats while they were still high and dry. Then, the submarines were to submerge under them, so that the boats could float off without a ripple. Once a beachhead was established, a destroyer would finally bring the remaining 165 men to the island. As for the Navy, it had the crucial task of providing gunfire support on the enemy positions, getting reinforced with 3 colossal old battleships, the escort carrier Nassau, and a large variety of cruisers and destroyers. Altogether, it was the largest American force to be assembled in the Pacific since the invasion of Guadalcanal. On May 3rd, although American intelligence reported that the Japanese knew about the planned invasion, the assault force would finally depart Cold Bay en route to Attu, cutting across the chain at Amchitka Pass and making a wide circle north of Kiska to avoid detection. By May 6th, Rockwell's force had reached the launch point, 100 miles north of Attu. Yet a storm blew in that evening. As the surf would be far too hazardous for troop landings, Rockwell would have to postpone the invasion until May 11th, when the storm ended at last. But in its aftermath, a soupy fog blanketed the Western Ocean, causing an unfortunate accident between 2 American destroyers. Meanwhile, Colonel Yamasaki had been warned to expect an American invasion on May 4th, so he immediately ordered his men to combat alert positions. He kept them like this for an entire week, but by May 10th, the Japanese forces were exhausted, and it looked like no enemy invasion was coming. Thus Yamasaki decided to leave the beaches unguarded, as his small force of 2,500 men couldn't possibly cover every landing point on the beaches. Because of this, his only chance was to occupy the high ground, draw the enemy back into the mountains away from their supplies, and fight a delaying action in the high passes. Yamasaki therefore pulled out of the low areas and built bunkers and trenches around the snowy ridges above the Massacre and Holtz valleys. Back on the Kuriles, Admiral Kawase could do little to oppose the American offensive in the near future. He could only send 3 submarines and a seaplane tender to raid the enemy, while he assembled a large force of battleships, aircraft carriers and cruisers to bring some 4,500 reinforcements for late May. During the early hours of May 11th, it was finally decided to commence the landings. At 0100, the submarines Nautilus and Narwhal emerged 3 miles off the western shore of Attu, allowing Captain Willoughby's scouts to inflate their rubber boats on the afterdecks in complete silence. Once the men were packed into the rubber boats, the submarines submerged and the boats began to float free. Rowing with haste in the cold weather, the scouts would successfully land at Beach Scarlet 2 hours later, immediately heading towards an icy little creek and climbing up its precipitous ravine towards the ridges, with no sign of the enemy. Behind them, however, they bitterly saw carrier fighters from Nassau come down on Beach Scarlet, strafing and destroying the scouts' rubber boats. With only 36 hours of food in their packs, the scouts' only possibility of retreat had thus been cut off. Further south, after a naval bombardment of Chichagov Harbor by the battleships Pennsylvania and Idaho, the largest of the 3 assault bodies had arrived on transports to Massacre Bay by early morning. Yet the fog forced the Americans to postpone the landings until noon, when General Brown ordered the southern force of Colonel Edward P. Earle to go ahead regardless of fog. At 15:30, the first wave started for shore, hitting Massacre Beach unopposed an hour later. The second wave then quickly followed, and by 1700, the 3 battalions of the regimental force had landed. In the meantime, at 0900, Colonel Frank Cullen led a scouting detachment to explore the route to Beach Red, the landing point of the northern force. Guided by the destroyer Phelps, the Americans advanced through thick water with perilous shoals and low visibility due to the fog, finally reaching the beach and finding no enemy defences there as well. Thus, Cullen's assault company was rapidly sent to land at Beach Red, and upon landing, they were immediately sent up the cliffs to avoid getting trapped on the tiny beach. In the next few hours, the rest of the 1st Battalion 17th Regiment would board its landing craft and begin their movement to Attu. By mid-afternoon, Cullen had 1,500 men ashore and climbing, with no sign at all of opposition. Back on Massacre Valley, Colonel Earl had decided to carry out a 2-pronged movement inland, which would be slow going in the muck of snow, mud and muskeg. Against them, 2 companies of the 303rd Independent Battalion had set up trenches on the ridge above Massacre Valley, with the fog concealing their positions. Ordered to destroy the enemy, they waited for the Americans to come within range. Yet the first shots of the battle would be fired just after 1800 by Brigadier General Archibald Arnold's Stark artillery against a Japanese mortar position on the ridge. After so long, the battle for Attu, for the Aleutians, was finally on. By 1900, the 2 battalions of the 17th Regiment had advanced a mile and a half from the beach, when the enemy fire from the high ground suddenly started, forcing the Americans to halt and take cover. Just in front, Japanese entrenchments dominated all approaches, and the Americans had to cross open slopes with no cover at all. After an hour of waiting for the enemy to cease, Earl had to gather his leading companies for a forward push towards the pass ahead. Yet the Japanese laid down heavy and accurate fire from their mortars and machine guns. In the confusion, the advance of the green American troops would grind to a halt half a mile below the pass. Relentless, Earl sent them up once more, but yet again the assault would break down under the same heavy fire from the fog-hidden heights. At nightfall, Earl would thus be forced to regroup behind a defensive perimeter, digging foxholes in the cold snow. Further north, after the landing of the remaining 165 men of the Scout Battalion, Willoughby continued his advance, working his way forward through the snow at an agonizingly slow pace. Darkness finally caught the Scouts on a mountain top in an icy, gale-blasting fog, and they would have to rest there for the night, in fear of being blown over an unseen cliff. To the east, Northern Force had already reached higher ground when Japanese artillery began to pound the tiny Beach Red. By 2200, the Americans were 2 miles inland, and less than a mile short of their goal, Hill X, a hilltop dominating Holt's Valley. There they would have to halt, as night prevented them from seeing forward. This would be a costly mistake though, as the Japanese would establish strong defensive positions on Hill X by daybreak. The next day, May 12th, started with a heavy bombardment of the ridges above Massacre Valley by the battleship Nevada, chewing great hunks of the mountains and inflicting many casualties on the enemy under the guidance of spotters on the ground. At 0400, Willoughby also got his half-frozen men on their feet and pushed forward once again, getting within range of the enemy's rear 4 hours later. They had managed to remain undetected, but now the Japanese could see them, so they turned west and opened fire. In response, the Scouts took cover behind ice boulders and rocks and returned fire with their mortars and machine guns. Dug in on the windy slope, Willoughby would begin a costly struggle that would successfully prevent the enemy from turning to attack the northern force. At 0900, the fog seemed to have lifted, so Colonel Earl ordered one of his battalions to attack the Jamin Pass defences. But once again, the troops could only make a few yards before they were stopped cold by withering fire from the fog above, finally being forced to crawl back to their foxholes. Furthermore, in an unfortunate event, Earl visited the front lines early in the afternoon, only to become a target for a Japanese sniper. The death of Colonel Earl was a serious loss, so General Brown immediately sent his Chief of Staff, Colonel Wayne Zimmerman, to take command of the southern force. At the same time, in the north, one of Colonel Kulin's companies attacked the right flank of the Japanese defences towards the Jamin Pass, but it too came under a fusillade from mortars, machine guns and rifles. Pinned down, the company would be unable to move forward or back, so it would have to be rescued. After launching a strong barrage on the enemy positions, Northern Force thankfully managed to push forward and link up with the isolated company. But from there, the tenacious Americans continued forward, moving uphill through heavy shooting. By late afternoon, Kulin's battalion had overrun the enemy's first line of defences, successfully capturing Hill X, yet the Japanese soon regrouped and launched a fierce counterattack, inflicting many casualties on the defenders, but at last failing to push them back. Meanwhile, Brown was pressing Rockwell to land his 2 reserve battalions, but unbeknownst to him, the transport Parida suffered an accident that left the Admiral with only 4 craft for shipping endeavours. On May 13th, the heavy fog would not lift until mid-morning, when Colonel Zimmermann threw his battalions against Jamin Pass once again. The soldiers flapped uphill through the snow, blazing at the Japanese guns above, and managed to get within 200 yards of the summit before the triple crossfire threw them back. After this defeat, Brown again pressed for his reinforcements, getting informed that the 2 battalions would arrive early in the afternoon. By mid-afternoon, the 1st Battalion, 32nd Regiment, had successfully landed, immediately moving up to fill in the front lines. But to the north, the landing of the 3rd Battalion, 32nd Regiment, would be prevented by steady, accurate fire from Japanese anti-aircraft guns. Meanwhile, both Northern Force and Willoughby's scouts were pinned down by the relentless attacks of the enemy, so Brown would call Rockwell to fire with Nevada against the Holtz Bay area. Despite the attack of a Japanese submarine, the enemy's flak guns were silenced, so the Americans took the opportunity to attack. The debilitated scouts, in their 2nd day without food, managed to drive the Japanese from the high ground, securing the summit and settling down just before nightfall in the extreme cold. To the east, Kulin's 1st Battalion also managed to drive the Japanese from their hilltop trenches with the assistance of Nassau's Wildcats. Before dark, the reinforcement battalion had also landed, going straight up to reinforce the exhausted troops at the front. With this success, and with the arrival of the reinforcements, Kulin then prepared to launch a full-scale assault towards the mountain pass and the enemy camp in Holtz Bay, to start in 36 hours. Upon getting informed of the incoming offensive, Brown ordered Zimmermann to postpone further southern attacks until Kulin could get into position on the far side of the pass, thus forcing Southern Force to pull its front lines further back. Colonel Zimmermann's Southern Force was pinned down at Massacre Valley, just in front of the Jamin Pass, while both Colonel Kulin's Northern Force and Captain Willoughby's Scout Battalion had made some progress in the Holtz Bay area and were preparing to launch a full-scale assault towards the mountains. The weather was bad, visibility was poor, and the fog continued to conceal the Japanese positions. Even worse, losses from exposure were mounting, as the clothing issued in San Francisco was not nearly warm enough for Attu's trenches. Thus the men were found to be frostbitten, feverish and unconscious, and they streamed to the rear by the score and then by the hundreds. Furthermore, their artillery was stuck far away from the battlefield, the supply situation was critical, and the Air Force was grounded at Adak and Amchitka. Despite this, General Brown decided to feel out the enemy defences with another assault on May 14th, throwing Zimmermann's 3rd Battalion against the Jamin Pass with the support of carrier aircraft. Yet Nassau's Wildcats would be caught by a Willy-War early in the morning, losing 3 fighters, and the troops would likewise run into a rain of fire that caused such severe casualties that Zimmermann was forced to relieve the battered unit with the 2nd Battalion 32nd Regiment. Further south, the newly arrived 1st Battalion 32nd Regiment was still bogged down on the overcrowded beach, as the unloading of transports had been carried out with a lack of efficiency. In contrast, Northern Force managed to keep the flow of supplies moving smoothly across Beach Red and up the front, a remarkable achievement that contributed to Kulin's success. The worrying situation in the south also forced Brown to reluctantly request to bring General Buckner's 4th Regiment from Adak. Yet Admirals Rockwell and Kinkaid refused, because of the congestion at the beach, something that didn't sit well with the army officers. Additionally, that morning, Rockwell's battleships had exhausted all their bombardment ammunition from afar, so they would go back to Adak to rearm, leaving Brown with a crucial lack of bombardment support. On the other side, Kinkaid was also unhappy at the army's lack of progress, so he requested Brown to write a report on the situation. Unfortunately, the PBY carrying the reports accidentally dropped them into the sea, so Kinkaid and Rockwell would grow angry with Brown's silence. In the meantime, Cullen's men fired and withstood mortar and artillery barrages as they consolidated their position, successfully inflicting many casualties on the desperate defenders. And in the mountains, Willoughby's scouts fought an all-day series of grim firefights in the intense cold, while very low on ammunition and with no food for the 3rd day straight. By evening, nearly half his men were casualties, but they had to keep crawling forward, as their only hope of survival was to break through the enemy lines. Luckily for them, Colonel Yamasaki would decide to withdraw his forces to the Moor Ridge on the far side of Holt's Valley, leaving behind large stores of ammunition and food. Evidently, they retreated to avoid getting caught between Northern Force and the Scout Battalion. Thus, on the morning of May 15th, Cullen's forces marched into Holt's Valley and spent the afternoon securing the area. With the enemy gone, Willoughby's straggling men also limped across the ridges, finally stumbling down into Holt's Bay and their salvation. About 80 men were left behind in rearguard positions, but the remaining 320 scouts would manage to join Northern Force. Although only 11 men had been killed, Willoughby's strength was down to 165 scouts, most of them suffering from gangrene and bandaged at their feet and knees. Meanwhile, Cullen readied his battalions to move east during the night, hoping to push back the Japanese from Moor Ridge to the Chichagov Valley in an effort to cut off the Jamin Pass defenders. Further south, Zimmermann led yet another frontal assault against the pass, but like the others, it fell back under a cruel fusillade from 3 directions. That noon, Rockwell also decided to pull out of Attu with his vessels within the next 24 hours, as his North Pacific force was a sitting duck. But meanwhile, Brown and Rockwell continued to argue over the transportation of the 4th Regiment. Communications were so bad and confusing that Brown would have to board Rockwell's flagship to discuss the matter personally, leaving General Arnold in temporary command ashore. Luckily, Brown managed to convince Rockwell as he made his plea, so Rockwell would ultimately send a message to Kinkaid endorsing Brown's request for the 4th Regiment. Additionally, they requested road equipment for Colonel Benjamin Talley's engineers, including fuel and construction supplies to last for 60 days, as they wanted to build roads to clear the jam on the beach. But unfortunately, Brown and Rockwell didn't foresee that their hastily worded message to Kinkaid left itself open to misinterpretation, as Kinkaid saw the engineers' request as an indication that Brown expected the battle to last for 60 days. It's important to remember that the original plan was to capture Attu in 3 days, and we were now in the 5th day of the battle. Furthermore, the message made it appear Brown had gone on the defensive and proposed to sit still until he got his reinforcements. This completely angered Kinkaid, who then decided to consult with Generals Buckner and DeWitt on what to do, both of whom never liked Brown in the first place. Thus, it would be ultimately decided to replace Brown because of his inexperience with the Aleutians. In his stead, General Landrum would be appointed to command the 7th Division, as he had already led with success the Adak landings. On May 16th, as they were informed of this decision, both Rockwell and Brown were shocked to learn this news, but there was not much they could do about it, as Landrum was already en route. In the meantime, Brown was still in command, so he ordered yet another head-on assault against the Jamin Pass by Zimmermann's forces. But once again, the attack would fall back without making a single dent in the effective enemy defences, suffering so many losses that the 2nd Battalion 32nd Regiment had to be relieved by the reformed 3rd Battalion 17th Regiment. To the north, however, Kulin's battalions had crossed the Holtz Valley under the cover of night and were putting much pressure on the Moor Ridge positions. Heavy fire from the rim pinned the attackers to the valley floor, but although the Japanese were defending Moor Ridge with great ferocity, Kulin would cunningly send out some platoons along the beach to his left in a flanking movement that successfully allowed the Americans to climb the steep seaside ends of the ridges. Against the tough opposition, they advanced from hump to hump and charged into several hours of savage hand-to-hand fighting, eventually securing a foothold on the ridge by nightfall. At this point, General Landrum had arrived to relieve Brown, and after an awkward meeting in which Landrum made it clear that he found no fault with what Brown had done and that he would continue with his tactical plans, the former 7th Division commander took his last look at Attu and began his return to the States. Without his knowledge, General DeWitt would later give him an unfavourable officer efficiency report, which blocked Brown's promotion chances later on in his career. On Moor Ridge, meanwhile, the Japanese were subsisting on one meal a day, usually a single ball of cold rice. Some broke under the strain of the cold and hunger, breaking away from the rest and attacking American positions in order to be shot and put out of their misery. With such weakened forces, Colonel Yamazaki ultimately decided to abandon Moor Ridge and the Holtz Bay area and retreat into the Prendergast and Fish Hook ridges during the night. This move also left the Jamin Pass defenders in an untenable position, so the 303rd Independent Battalion would be ordered to pull back and defend the Klevsi Pass instead, just as Kulin and Brown had expected. Shortly after midnight on May 17th, Kulin launched a night attack to take the rest of Moor Ridge, and after a couple of hours of cautious advance, the 3rd Battalion 32nd Regiment reached the ridge top to find that the Japanese had withdrawn from Holtz Valley, leaving behind large stocks of supplies and equipment, including their artillery guns. Unbeknownst to them, however, the carrier Nassau had launched a bomb-strafing attack against the ridge Kulin had just taken, unfortunately wounding several men. As a result, Kinkaid would decide to send Colonel Eriksson to Attu to coordinate airstrikes with ground operations. Northern Force would spend the rest of the day consolidating their positions in Holtz Bay, which now allowed the Americans to move their ships into the west arm of Holtz Bay and use the good harbour facilities there instead of the little strip at Beach Red. Additionally, Captain Willoughby sent some patrols to link with Southern Force at Jamin Pass, which would arrive there the next morning. Further south, the fog prevented Zimmermann from noticing that the enemy had retreated. As he sent some patrols to the pass, which effectively found the enemy gone, he would finally occupy the Jamin Pass with a fresh company by the end of the day. As a last note, the 1st Battalion 4th Regiment would also arrive from Adak on this day, further increasing the strength of the attackers after the Holtz Bay breakthrough. On May 18th, Admiral Rockwell thus declared the end of the amphibious phase of the battle, at last taking with him the bulk of his naval forces back to Adak. Now it was time to transition into a phase of full mountain warfare. Despite this success, the intact Japanese units had managed to withdraw in order, establishing once again some well-prepared defences on the jagged terrain around Chichagov Valley, including its precipitous several thousand feet tall heights. Up to this point, the American force had suffered more than 1,100 casualties, 500 of them from exposure cases, had lost 90 of the 93 landing craft and boats they had started with to Attu's shoals, reefs and willowas, and had been unable to carry out air missions against the Japanese defences due to the relentless fog. On May 18th, as the attackers transitioned to this new phase of mountain warfare, Landrum decided to give his commanders a day to regroup and reorganize for the new offensive, which was to jump off early the next morning. His plan was for Zimmermann's Southern Force to seize Klevsi Pass and then secure the approaches to Chichagov Harbour, while the 1st Battalion 4th Regiment and Kulin's Northern Force captured the heights of Prendergast Ridge in preparation for a final attack against Chichagov. Throughout the day, Zimmermann and Kulin shuffled exhausted units into the reserves and brought up fresher troops, while Colonel Eriksson, in a little Kingfisher, made strafing attacks below the fog to pick out targets that would be bombed by his bombers above the clouds. Additionally, Colonel Talley's engineers began to build a road up a stream bed to move artillery inland, and Admiral Rockwell also sent a force of PT boats to carry supplies ashore, successfully reducing the jam of supplies at the beaches. By sunset, Zimmermann and Kulin were ready to jump off, with the former sending 2 companies to probe the enemy defences at Klevsi Pass during the night, although to no avail. During the morning of May 19th, the main offensive finally started, with Zimmermann sending his 2nd Battalion 17th Regiment to attack the pass after a strong artillery barrage, while Kulin pushed his 2 battalions against the Chichagov foothills. At noon, the 2nd Battalion 32nd Regiment also joined to support the southern attack. Japanese opposition was fierce enough to halt Kulin's advance, but on the Klevsi Pass, the air and mortar bombardments managed to soften up the enemy defences, allowing the attackers to capture the first high ground. Yet Zimmermann's advance would ultimately be stopped by a company of the 303rd Independent Battalion, which had once again established some very strong positions on a great mountain, Point Abel. On May 20th, one of Zimmermann's companies also launched a successful early morning attack to secure Cold Mountain, in spite of the intense enemy machine gun fire. By noon, the Japanese only continued to hold Nees Point with a force of around 50 men, although they would successfully manage to repel every American attack until the end of the day. Further to the northwest, Kulin was fighting a grim inch-by-inch battle for every blood-stained hill, and by the end of May 20th, he would only gain a few hundred yards, no more. At the same time, the 1st Battalion 4th Regiment finally entered the battle, moving over Klevsi Pass and beginning its ascension of the Prendergast Ridge. Facing strong resistance, General Buckner's well-trained troops would manage to reach the top of the cold and icy windswept ridge the following night, and would then begin to move towards the Saranaholz Pass. Additionally, the carrier Nassau launched its final mission on this day, as its Wildcats bombed and strafed the main Japanese positions in the Chichagov harbour area during the afternoon. Nassau then departed shortly afterwards for Adak, having lost 5 pilots and 8 planes. On May 21st, more air attacks by Ericsson's bombers managed to destroy every building in Chichagov village, and later that day, the colonel would even walk to the front lines, borrow a rifle, and start shooting at Point Abel, unfortunately getting shot and wounded. On the Klevsi Pass, Zimmermann's battalions kept pushing north into the mountains against strong resistance, but to no avail. The breakthrough would have to wait until nightfall, when Company E, 32nd Regiment, made a bold charge up the slopes of Point Abel and managed to wipe out the enemy company to the last man. Further north, Kulin's battalions had succeeded in occupying Hill 4 of 4 hills leading up to Prendergast Ridge, when General Landrum suddenly ordered them to support Southern Force and seize Fishhook Ridge, overlooking Chichagov Harbour. To the far west, Admiral Kawase was circling off the Komandorskis when he reported the overwhelming size of the American fleet around Attu. This was seen as very troublesome news by Tokyo, which finally decided to evacuate their Aleutian garrisons by submarine instead of reinforcing them. The following day, 19 G4M bombers from Paramashiro additionally managed to find a patch of clear sky over Holtz Bay to drop packages over Chichagov Harbour and attack the American vessels, losing 2 Bettys as a result. On the morning of May 22nd, Zimmermann found his eastern advance blocked by the remnants of the 303rd Battalion's company on a peak called Sarana Nose, so he decided to send the reserve 3rd Battalion 17th Regiment to take the peak after a heavy and well-coordinated 30-minute artillery barrage that devastated the entrenched enemy positions. The bombardment would allow the Americans to swiftly take Sarana Nose from the dazed defenders, successfully annihilating the 303rd as a fighting force with only a handful of casualties. Meanwhile, on the left flank, the 4th Regiment troops also went into action along the Prendergast Ridge, and after another strong artillery bombardment, they would manage to drive the defenders down the far side of the ridge. To the north, Kulin was facing the heaviest resistance, so General Landrum saw no point in attacking hardest on that front. With the breakthroughs achieved on the southern front, Kulin only needed to hold on while Zimmermann led the main attack from the south. Yet the day's aerial photos showed that a direct attack up the valley floor would bring Southern Force under devastating fire from the ridges that overlooked the valley. So instead, the Americans would have to secure Fishhook Ridge first. With Kulin pressing from the north, Zimmermann would send the 2nd Battalion 32nd Regiment to take the high plateau on the left side of Jimfish Valley. Repeating the same effective strategy as before, the artillery barrage would leave only limited opposition against the American advance. At this point, the Japanese situation was desperate. They had severe food shortages, they were completely isolated, and, fighting a protracted battle of attrition, they only hoped to kill as many Americans as possible. But although Colonel Yamasaki was now trapped behind his innermost defensive perimeter, his brilliant delaying action left him in possession of a defensive firepower more concentrated than before. Thus, despite the hundreds of casualties that the Japanese had suffered, Yamasaki now counted with more soldiers to defend each yard of ground. May 23rd opened with a heavy fog and snowy weather, which prevented Zimmermann from launching his main attack. Instead, he could send only his 2 leading battalions to relieve the exhausted 4th Regiment troops. Some small units were also sent to make exploratory probes towards the ridge, but all of them were stopped by determined Japanese resistance on Buffalo Ridge. Meanwhile, to the west, Kulin's stubborn battlers pressed towards a junction beneath Fishhook Ridge, finally linking up with Southern Force to launch a coordinated assault the next morning. The only notable action of the day happened in the air, when General Butler's Lightnings successfully intercepted a flight of 16 Bettys, shooting down 9 bombers and losing 2 fighters in the engagement. Because of the losses sustained, there would be no more airstrikes coming from Paramushiro. On the morning of May 24th, the coordinated assault against the ridge would start. The Americans had to fight hard for every inch of ice-crusted muskeg, suffering heavy casualties against the fierce and desperate defenders. Air bombing was also carried out throughout the day, though unfortunately some bombs would fall over American positions. Eventually, Landrum would have to send again the 4th Regiment troops to reinforce the southern advance because of the staunch opposition. Thankfully, by the end of the day, Kulin's battalions would manage to get 2 companies into the Holt-Sarana Pass. Additionally, in preparation for the next day's attack, Landrum ordered every available artillery piece to be dragged up to the newly built road in Massacre Valley. On May 25th, airstrikes and artillery supported a new assault against the pass, where the defenders were concealed by so much fresh snow they were practically invisible. Charging against a rain of fire, the southern attack would manage to clear the Newman Peak overlooking the pass, though the northern advance would be stopped in the face of determined Japanese fire. Nonetheless, by nightfall, Zimmermann would have control over the base of the ridge, with isolated slopes being in the hands of scattered companies. But as the Americans were advancing further away from the beaches where they'd landed, they were now starting to suffer from a shortage of supplies, so they needed to end this battle as quickly as possible. Luckily, May 26th started with good weather, which allowed the American aircraft to bomb the enemy positions with more precision. Kulin used this opportunity to launch another assault to secure the Holt-Sarana Pass, gradually and at a high cost pushing back the concealed defenders foxhole by foxhole. Thanks to the sacrifice of Private Joe Martinez, Northern Force would eventually manage to overcome the Japanese snow trenches concealed by snowdrifts and rocks, thus securing the northwestern razorback of the Fishhook. Now the only remaining obstacle in the way to the trapped Japanese was Buffalo Ridge. In the meantime, the 4th Regiment troops continued their advance along the knife-edge Fishhook Ridge, successfully overcoming Japanese resistance along the way and reaching the summit of West Peak by the end of the day, although they could go no further from here because of the near-vertical drop into Chichagov. On May 27th, weather socked down once again, hiding the peaks from view and allowing Colonel Yamasaki to dispatch reinforcements. Zimmermann, meanwhile, sent a reinforced battalion to take Buffalo Ridge, supported by a strong artillery barrage. But again, the stubborn and tenacious defenders would successfully halt the American assaults, although Zimmermann's troops would nonetheless manage to inch up within 200 yards of the ridge's crest. During the morning of May 28th, another strong assault would be launched against Buffalo Ridge, yet again supported by heavy artillery. This time, however, the 2nd Battalion 32nd Regiment would reach the top of the ridge facing only limited resistance. By grueling 1-yard advances, the Americans would manage to secure most of the buffalo by the end of the day. Meanwhile, a reinforced battalion down Jimfish Valley got to a point just beyond the south end of Lake Cories and established a night defense position in preparation for what Landrum expected to be the final attack against Chichagov Harbor, which was to be carried out the next morning. Thus, the Americans now dominated the high ground around Chichagov, a mirror image of the situation at the start of the battle. With their backs to the sea, the Japanese had been pushed into a crowded little area of low flat ground, only counting with around 800 soldiers left. Worthy of mention at this point is that after the capture of 2 Japanese soldiers who confessed that their force was weaker than it appeared, Landrum decided to fabricate and drop a bundle of leaflets over the Japanese positions, praising their tenaciousness and encouraging them to surrender to avoid a senseless slaughter. But the fanatical enemy would not, even knowing that the submarines meant to evacuate them had been turned back by the American destroyer screen. There was no point in withdrawing further back to continue with the resistance, so Colonel Yamasaki decided to do the unthinkable: counterattack. His plan was to hit the weakest point of the American encircling line during the night, when they could not be seen, and break through to raid the enemy's supplies. Once the enemy's supplies and artillery had been seized or destroyed, the Japanese were to withdraw into the southern mountains, where Yamasaki hoped that he could continue to resist until they could be reinforced or evacuated. The slim chance of victory depended on speed. They had to charge and keep charging until they could take the American artillery on Engineer Hill. The reward to Yamasaki's gamble could be victory. The certain penalty for failure would be mass death. By nightfall, Yamasaki would thus silently assemble all his forces just in front of the narrow confines between Lake Cories and the lower slopes of Fishhook Ridge. During the early morning hours of May 29th, his desperate attack would finally commence, immediately smashing against the positions held by the Reserve Company B 32nd Regiment. The inexperienced company had set up dead center in Chichagov Valley, but for some unexplained reason they had withdrawn back to the rear during the night for a hot breakfast, so their deserted positions would be swiftly overwhelmed, and the company would be sent packing to the buffalo. Yamasaki let them go, and then decided to press towards Engineer Hill. In an agonic banzai charge, the screaming Japanese would move down Jimfish Valley and across Siddons Valley, catching the 3rd Battalion by surprise, brushing past the companies deployed across Jimfish Valley, and inflicting many casualties on the unsuspecting defenders. Yamasaki's timing was brilliant, completely taking the Americans by surprise and finding no organized enemy resistance. The Japanese assault then swept up the base of Engineer Hill and easily got to be beyond the enfilading fire from the ridges by daybreak. Yet in their savagery, a number of the invaders also lost considerable time killing helpless patients in a medical station. Meanwhile, high on Engineer Hill, General Arnold organized his artillerymen, engineers and service troops to establish hidden defensive positions. Lacking automatic weapons, the ragtag force managed to stop the brunt of the Japanese charge with grenades, with Arnold directing where to throw them as if he were calling artillery targets. Finally, some automatic weapons of the 4th Regiment were brought forward, successfully slowing down and finally stopping the Japanese banzai charge when Yamasaki was within rock-throwing distance. The engineers would then rush forward and charge with bayonets fixed, engaging the desperate attackers in confusing hand-to-hand combat, and at last forcing them to fall back. Defeated, Yamasaki's forces tried to charge again, but they could never regain the momentum. Eventually they would be isolated and surrounded, forcing the bulk of the Japanese forces to commit suicide by pulling the pins of their grenades and holding them against their chests. Yamasaki himself would lead a last foredoomed attack on Engineer Hill, and he would finally perish with his men, sword in hand. Shortly after the battle, the Americans erected a wooden interpretive sign at the foot of Klevsi Pass honoring him, a rare gesture considering the intensity of the war at the time. On the verge of victory, the Americans had come frighteningly close to losing everything they had gained in 3 weeks of ferocious, bloody and relentless fighting. After the annihilation of Yamasaki's desperate forces, the Americans would occupy Chichagov Harbor on May 30th, proceeding to mop up the marauding bands of Japanese soldiers still resisting on the hills. Only 28 of them were captured during the battle. The remaining almost 2,900 Japanese personnel were killed or committed suicide. The cost for the Americans had been high as well: 3,289 casualties, of which 549 had been killed, 1,148 had been wounded, 1,200 had severe cold injuries, and 614 had diseases from exposure. But with the capture of Attu, the Kiska fortress was now completely isolated, and the Japanese had no other choice but to abandon their presence in the Aleutian Islands. After the end of the Battle of Attu, all that remained on the tiny island were the piles of Japanese bodies left behind by the carnage. The Americans had also suffered substantial casualties, as this had been the costliest ground battle yet fought in the Pacific, but most of them were still alive, whereas the entire garrison of Colonel Yamasaki had been wiped out entirely. Nonetheless, although many costly mistakes had been committed, the lessons taught during the battle were numerous and important. American commanders learned about the fanaticism and willingness to die of the Japanese, finding them to be masters at camouflage, concealment, and infiltration, but also discovering their many weaknesses at all-around defense. Most importantly, however, planners began to conceive and take into account that weather and terrain posed the greatest threat to success, something that would prove to be invaluable in future operations. As we'll recall, while the Battle of Attu raged, the Japanese had issued a directive on May 21st for the evacuation of Kiska's almost 6,000 soldiers, primarily by submarine, but also calling for the use of surface ships, weather permitting. If possible, the Attu garrison was to be rescued as well, although time would prove that this would not be the case. Fearing an attack against the northern Kuriles, the directive also addressed its defences. It called for the deployment of fighters and anti-aircraft units to provide air defense, and shore batteries to protect against an amphibious invasion, also requiring improvements in the infrastructure of Paramashiro. The Japanese submarine evacuation of Kiska began on May 27th, as the I-7 arrived at Kiska with food, ammunition, and a radio beacon. The submarine took aboard 60 passengers, mostly sick and wounded, 28 boxes of ashes of those who died on the island, and 4 tons of spent shell cartridges. Other I-class submarines managed to make it through the blockade, but the attrition rate proved too costly. Admiral Kawase himself considered that it would take 40 or 50 round trips to evacuate the entire Kiska garrison. As the Japanese didn't have enough time for that, they began planning a surface evacuation. In the meantime, the Americans had also carried out the simultaneous invasions of the islands of Shemya and Igetu, in which Brigadier General John Copeland led a landing force that included elements of General Buckner's 4th Regiment and Colonel Talley's 18th Engineers. Going ashore at Shemya in a tough storm, the Americans were to survey the little island for the building of the first attack airfield expressly designed to accommodate the experimental new long-range B-29 Superfortress heavy bomber. With their usual blinding speed, the American engineers would make the Attu air station operational by June 8th, and would further activate the Shemya airfield 2 weeks later. Additionally, the 11th Air Force would be reinforced with squadrons of the new PV-1 Ventura bombers, equipped with the latest airborne radar, which gave a clear picture of topographical contours that would be of much use in the Arctic weather and at nighttime. Admiral Kincaid would also reinforce the Kiska blockade with an impenetrable screen of destroyers, cruisers, and battleships. Throughout June, General Butler's forces would plaster Kiska, while the enemy carried out its evacuation, flying a total of 407 bombing sorties, although the formidable Japanese arsenal of around 70 anti-air batteries would have much success hindering the job of the airmen with their withering accuracy. Uncontested, the Americans would make further unopposed landings on Senesipochmoy and the Rat Islands, covered only by PT boats. With the new Attu and Shemya bases, they also now had sufficient range to bomb Paramashiro, the huge Gibraltar-like base that guarded the northern approach to Japan, so a new raid would be scheduled for July. After 2 unsuccessful attempts, the Americans would finally manage to bomb Paramashiro on July 18th. Though the 6 B-24 Liberators would not inflict any serious damage, the raid proved to the Japanese that their home soil was no longer immune to attack, so the Empire could no longer depend on distance or its Aleutian bases to act as a buffer. Forced to reinforce the Kurils and Hokkaido, the Japanese would have to move out men, guns, ships and planes from the Solomons and the Philippines, leaving those places considerably weakened. Meanwhile, because of the success that they were having, Buckner and Kinkaid saw their budget increase exponentially as the Joint Chiefs approved the preparation of an invasion of Japan from the Aleutians, setting the date of the invasion to early 1945. Expecting another costly operation like the invasion of Attu, the Americans had assigned the 7th Division, Buckner's 4th Regiment, the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment, the 13th Canadian Brigade, and a force of elite American-Canadian commandos to the invasion of Kiska, codenamed Operation Cottage, which was to be carried out in the second week of August. We'll recall that a thorough air campaign against the island had been carried out during the month of June, with even more bombing sorties being launched in July. Additionally, on July 6th, Admiral Giffin steamed towards Kifka with 4 cruisers and 4 destroyers, with the objective of shelling the island fortress. The 22-minute naval bombardment caused only a handful of casualties, but it would manage to convince Admiral Kawase that the Americans would soon invade Kiska. As the evacuation of the garrison by submarine was proving too slow and costly, Kawase had thus decided to steam boldly into the Aleutians with a surface fleet to make an assault on the enemy vessels around Kiska, and to take advantage of the dense fog to evacuate all men simultaneously. Admiral Kimura and his 1st Destroyer Squadron were assigned to command the run, with the convoy subsequently assembling at Paramashiro. To support them, 11 submarines would also be deployed for reconnaissance. On July 7th, Kimura departed for Kiska, expecting to arrive there 5 days later. But on July 12th, with the convoy 500 miles south of the island, the Japanese were disappointed to see the fog clear. Kimura had learned his lesson at the Bismarck Sea and knew how dangerous the enemy airstrikes could be, so he decided to wait and see if the dense fog would reappear to cover his movements. As the weather remained clear, however, he would decide to head back on July 15th. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Akiyama Monzo decided to send his troops to frantically lay out a road from their underground base to the harbour piers to facilitate the evacuation. At this point, the soldiers were suffering a painful deprivation and had little hope that the Japanese fleet could arrive before the enemy landed. Luckily for them, Japanese weather stations would report that there would definitely be dense fog around Kiska by July 25th, so Kimura would depart Paramashiro once again on July 22nd, accompanied by Kawase aboard the cruiser Tama. Yet on July 19th, Kinkaid had also dispatched a 2-pronged naval attack force under Admiral Giffin to pummel Kiska with shells. Reaching Kiska on July 22nd, Giffin's battleships and cruisers would fire a total of 424,000 pounds of high explosive onto the island. Less than an hour later, however, the American vessels were ordered to speed west and intercept a force of 7 enemy ships, which had been detected by a PBY's radar and was believed to be a reinforcement convoy. But by doing so, Kinkaid also essentially left Kiska Harbour unguarded, something that was very favourable to the enemy. At the same time, the Japanese convoy had run into a dense fog, so Kimura's ships would have to proceed separately. The fog would also prevent the Americans from intercepting the Japanese, so a worried Kinkaid would order Giffin to return to Kiska at top speed on July 25th. That day, the fog unexpectedly cleared, and Kimura's vessels began to reunite under a cloudless sky. Shortly before 0100 on July 26th, however, the battleship Mississippi's SC radar finally detected the 7 enemy vessels 15 miles to the northeast. Within seconds, other warships recorded the same radar images, and so the Americans would turn to the left while firing at ranges from 8 to 12 miles. As they tracked the 7 radar pips, Giffin's vessels would discharge their main batteries into the radar contacts for 67 minutes. By 0130, Mississippi's log recorded zigzags and a 20-degree course change, but no human eyes had yet seen the enemy. cruisers San Francisco and Santa Fe also registered shell splashes, but never the alleged targets. 75 miles away at Kiska, Japanese sentries were treated to a spectacular nighttime light show on the horizon. By 0222, the last pip had faded out, and the Americans ceased their fire. At dawn, they would search the wide area that had been shot, but Giffen would be surprised to find nothing, not even debris. To this day, it's still unknown what caused the Battle of the Pips, but it's speculated that the American radars had picked up 7 of these submarines that Kawase had deployed for reconnaissance. What is certain is that the US Navy's official conclusion, blaming the echoes on atmospheric phenomena, is very likely wrong. Despite a foggy chain collision that saw the destroyer Wakaba suffer heavy damage, Kimura had managed to sneak through undetected and unharmed. While Giffen retreated to refuel, the Japanese convoy steamed north during the night of July 27th, crossing the area of the Battle of the Pips and reaching a point about 50 miles southwest of Kiska. There, Kimura waited for the weather to thicken, but threatened by an impending invasion of Kiska, Admiral Kawase finally decided to proceed anyway without the protection of fog. Shortly before noon on July 28th, Kimura therefore set out to cover the last 50 miles to Kiska. The entire garrison of 5,183 men, already assembled at the harbour beaches to meet the approaching ships, would be subsequently embarked in less than an hour. By nightfall, the overcrowded convoy steamed out of Kiska harbour at full speed, and 4 days later, Kimura and Kawase reached Paramashiro, successfully evacuating Kiska without firing a single shot. On the other side, the Americans were unaware of the withdrawal of the enemy, so Kinkaid would continue to carry out naval and air bombardment missions against the unoccupied island, thus wasting many resources while continuing preparations for Operation Cottage. Kawase had pulled off one of the war's most imaginative and daring maneuvers without a single casualty, but the full effect of his brilliant operation would not be felt until 3 weeks later, when Kiska would be finally invaded. General Buckner and Admiral Kinkaid still had no knowledge of the successful Japanese evacuation of Kiska as they continued to plan ahead for Operation Cottage, with the planned amphibious invasion of Kiska set for August 15th. In the meantime, the ring around the island fortress had been drawn up tighter after the embarrassing Battle of the Pips, with 10 naval bombardments being carried out by the new task forces of Rear Admirals Wilder Baker and Howard Kingman in early August. Additionally, General Butler's 11th Air Force used up to 359 combat planes to keep up a continuous 3-week air raid that continually pummeled the now deserted Kiska defenses. Although American pilots eventually managed to detect that no repairs were being made above ground, the dense fog that covered the island, erroneous reports of fire coming from the ground during air missions, and the fact that the Japanese were known to go underground during air attacks prevented them from completely concluding that the once mighty fortress was now abandoned. Nonetheless, preparations for Operation Cottage were ready by early August. The previous experience at Attu had impressed upon Kinkaid that he would need a big enough force, enough equipment, and the right clothing and food to successfully take Kiska. Thus, the joint American-Canadian Kiska force of Major General Charles Corlett numbered a total of 34,426 troops altogether. Equipped with new Arctic gear, Corlett's force would train at Adak, practice amphibious landings from LCIs and LCTs, and accustom itself to muskeg travel. Meanwhile, Admiral Rockwell would command the naval force, as he had done at Attu, and Kinkaid would have overall command of the operation. On August 13th, the huge American force finally left Adak, covered by more than 100 warships, and with Admiral Baker's group shelling Kiska with 60 tons of munitions the day before. The journey to the abandoned island fortress would be largely uneventful, so by August 15th, Rockwell's transports would gather off Kiska in a light fog. Corlett's plan was to stage a diversionary landing using a detachment of the Alaska Scouts at Gertrude Cove, which was assumed to be heavily fortified, while an advance force of American-Canadian commandos secured the western side of the island, and the main force landed at a beach in the north near the Kiska volcano. Growling through the surf towards the shore and squinting through the mist, Colonel Verbeck's scouts and Colonel Robert Frederick's commandos would be the first to come ashore. Met with deserted machine gun nests, they walked into the mountains, investigated caves and ravines, and found nothing but destroyed equipment. Yet they still thought that the enemy was probably up in the hills, saving its ammunition and waiting to ambush them. During the morning, the main force would also land at the northern side of Kiska, rapidly climbing the precipitous cliffs in front to obtain their initial objectives. But the Japanese had further left behind many booby traps, which surprised the Allied troops and inflicted several casualties. In the icy rain, the explosions also startled the soldiers, who began to shoot into the disorientating fog, many times against their own allies. The following day, Corlit's forces would continue to climb uphill, but Japanese fortifications were always found empty. The remaining forces were also brought over, while a detachment of American-Canadian commandos landed unopposed at Little Kiska Island. By August 18th, Corlit was confident that the enemy was nowhere on Kiska, although he would be forced to continue his search for Japanese troops hiding in mountain caves until August 22nd. The successful capture of Kiska finally brought an end to the Aleutians campaign, but it had been a huge blunder to commit such large ground, air and naval forces to the bombardment and invasion of an abandoned island, since these could have been better employed in the South Pacific. Furthermore, Corlit's force had suffered 66 casualties to friendly fire and booby traps, 130 men had gotten trenchfoot, and the destroyer Abner Red also struck a Japanese mine on August 18th, suffering 70 dead and 47 wounded for a total of 313 casualties. Corlit admittedly was tickled pink we didn't have to fight, and Kincaid agreed. Of course, we had no way of anticipating our men would shoot each other in the fog. Generals Buckner and DeWitt then wanted to threaten Japan's northern flank with an invasion of Paramushiro, yet the Joint Chiefs of Staff would eventually reject this proposal, because it was easier and more valuable to attack through the South and Central Pacific. Ultimately, Buckner's Alaskan force would be vastly reduced, and most of the Aleutian veterans would be redeployed elsewhere. Yet Buckner's contributions to the development of Alaska's military strength and to Alaska itself during his 4-year tenure as head of the Alaska Defense Command would leave an indelible mark on the soon-to-be American. In the end, during the entire Alaskan campaign, the Americans lost 1,481 men killed, 640 missing, 8 captured, and 3,416 wounded, while the Japanese lost 4,360 men killed and 28 captured. On the naval aspect, the Americans lost the destroyer Warden, the submarines S-27 and Grunion, and the barracks ship Northwestern, with the heavy cruiser Salt Lake City and the destroyer Abner Road further being heavily damaged. In turn, the Japanese lost the destroyers Arare, Nenohi, and Oboro, the submarines I-7, I-9, I-24, I-31, Ro-61, and Ro-65, and 9 transport ships, with the heavy cruiser Nachi and the destroyers Hatsuharu, Hibiki, Kasumi, and Shiranuhi being further damaged. The Arctic air warfare was particularly bloody, with the Americans losing a total of 225 aircraft, of which 41 were destroyed during combat, and the rest mainly to the deadly Arctic weather. This included 126 F-4F-4 and P-40 fighters, 2 A-24 light bombers, 25 B-18, B-25 and B-26 medium bombers, 32 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers, 36 PBY Catalina and PV-1 Ventura patrol planes, 3 A-29 Hudson reconnaissance planes, and 1 SOC-1 Seagull float plane. The Americans in turn claimed the destruction of 57 Japanese aircraft, either shot down or destroyed on the ground, which included 15 A-6M2 float planes, 6 E-13A reconnaissance seaplanes, 5 G-4M medium bombers, 4 D-3A dive bombers, 2 H-6K flying boats, 1 E-8N reconnaissance seaplane, and 1 Zero fighter. It is, however, not known how many planes the Japanese lost to the inclement weather, which probably helped destroy another 100 aircraft. As such, we can see that the campaign in Alaska and the Aleutians saw both sides suffer very similar casualty numbers, as both were not entirely prepared to fight under such conditions, so different to what they were accustomed to enduring throughout the rest of the Pacific War. Both had to adapt to survive, and although the Americans ended up victorious and managed to regain all their lost territory, they paid handsomely in blood for each Japanese killed, for each air and naval attack conducted, and for each square mile of ground recovered. More long-form videos and more videos on the Pacific War are on the way, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member-exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.